Moment, all we have is a README. So let's make some HTML. You can use touch here, or you can do it in here if you want. Let's do it in here this time. New file, index.html. I'll go ahead and make index.js and index.css. So we know we're going to sooner or later. So in index.html, type HTML. You should have some autocomplete options. I'm going to choose the one that says simple HTML5 starting point. That'll go ahead and highlight my title, so I'll change it before I forget. Tatum Tots. There's already going to be a link to a style sheet in here, but it's going to be to main CSS, and we name ours index. And there's going to be a link to a JavaScript file called main. We'll call it index. And we have not been putting our script tags in the head, right, but at the end of the body. Do you remember why we do that? Anybody remember why we do that? Yeah, Jacob.
So the JavaScript starts executing after all the HTML is already set up.
Yeah, after the DOM's already loaded. Because if we start doing document.querySelector and something isn't on the page yet, if our JavaScript executes too fast, that's a problem. So if we put it down here, we'll know the DOM is loaded. So that's what we do. Cool. I will check real quick. I'll go ahead and open this up in my browser. Open up my DevTools. Make sure there are no errors. And I'm going to look on my Sources tab here and make sure that all three files are there. There's nothing in the CSS file or the JavaScript file yet, but before I start writing stuff in there, I want to make sure they're linked up correctly. This confirms to me that they are linked up correctly. And this time we're going to use a CSS framework just to give us some styles out of the box. Anybody use a framework like Bootstrap or Foundation or Material, Google Material or anything like that? Anybody? Who's used one? Okay, not a ton. We're going to use Foundation this time. So we're going to learn a little bit about that. It's very well documented. Let's just look for it. Foundation CSS. Here we go. Zerb Foundation. Foundation.zerb.com. I will put a link to this in Slack. This one afternoon. Well, I'll go to the documentation first. So I'm going to go ahead and go straight to the docs. There is a Foundation for sites and Foundation for emails. We're doing sites, of course. So here's the documentation. There's a nice friendly video. Where's the, didn't I paste something in already? Oh, not yet. Here we go. Here's a link to the Foundation docs. And we could download the CSS and just put it in our project and link to it from there. Or we could link to it from a CDN. Let somebody else host it for us. Anybody know what a CDN is? Content Delivery Network. Basically, for some really common libraries and stuff, open source libraries, they're hosted on basically big, highly reliable servers that you can link to avoid using your bandwidth, for one thing, and because if, for example, lots of sites load the same thing from the same CDN, then it'll cache in people's browsers and they won't have to download the same library a million times. Like, I don't know how many libraries you visit a day that have jQuery loaded. jQuery is pretty dang big. If you had to actually download it every time, that would be a bummer. But if they're using a CDN for it, you may not have to download it every time. And if you're doing it from your cell phone, that's a bit of a blessing. So we're going to load Foundation from a CDN. We're going to load it from one with a name that's easy to remember. CDN.js. So CDNJS.com. Search from 3,355 libraries with a whole bunch of different versions. Cool. So let's search for Foundation. There it is. It gives us a quick link right there, but that's a link to Foundation's JavaScript. Foundation is a fairly big framework. It's got all kinds of front-end stuff, JavaScript and CSS alike. We're only interested in the CSS. So just click right here on the name of the library. And you'll see links to lots of different files. We just want the CSS, but there's like Foundation Float, Foundation Prototype. We just want Foundation CSS. But there's foundation.css and then there's foundation.min.css. We talked about minification very briefly the first day, I think, when we talked about semicolons. So the minified version just takes out all the white space and makes the file as small as it can be without changing it. And that's fine for our purposes. We don't need to be able to read it. It's okay if the whole file's on one line. We just need to use it. We're not going to be editing it or anything. So just copy the URL for foundation.min.css. And we're going to add an additional style sheet link here. Put it before the one to our custom styles. There are a variety of ways that CSS determines which rule applies to an element, which rule or rules, if there's more than one that matches. One of those is the order in which they're loaded. So you always load your custom styles last. So right above this link, I'm going to make another link tag and just paste that URL in there. Here, I'm going to paste this entire line in there into Slack. All right. I'm just going to refresh the page and see if anything changes. Well, there's nothing on there, is there? Let's put an H1 on there. Tatum Tots. Refresh. There we go. Now I happen to recognize that that is the default font for Foundation. But again, we can look at the Sources tab and see we have index.html, index.js, index.css, and from CDN.js, we have Foundation CSS. Cool. So it worked. Foundation is also a responsive framework, meaning that it adjusts to the width of the window. So notice the font size of the H1 actually changes as it gets really narrow, just so it fits better on phones. And there's a lot more than just like changing the font size of headings that it can do, but that's one of the things. Now, while I'm making this boilerplate HTML here, I'm actually going to do it slightly differently this time. I'm going to put the H1 inside another element called header. Header is one of the HTML5 elements. It's just like a div. It's just a block level element, but it has some semantic meaning. Header means something. So things like header, main, footer, section, article, these were all new elements introduced in HTML5. They behave just like divs, but that makes it a little easier to target them with CSS. We don't have to say like div with an ID of header. We can just say header because now there's actually an element called that. So I'll again use that keyboard shortcut I told you about yesterday. Well, you won't have it unless you did what it says on the website, but on the website under Tools, VS Code Bindings, one of my keyboard shortcuts here is Shift-Command-A, which runs the command wrap with abbreviation. Super, super handy. I do recommend updating your config files with that if you think of it. Yeah. This one? So that links to our index.css, our style sheet. As long as you changed it to say index instead of main. Yeah. So they're each just linked to style sheets. This is a style sheet that's actually hosted in the cloud. This is our style sheet that we haven't put anything in yet. Do you have to specify what? I'm sorry? Media screen. You do not have to. It's not a bad idea. There are print style sheets. It is not required. You can also specify it in a media query inside the style sheet, but much of the time you're actually going to want it to apply both to print and screen, so let's actually take it out. All right. So add boilerplate HTML and Foundation CSS. Questions?